Eleanor and John Thompson had built a life together that many envied. Their home, a stately old house in the leafy suburbs of Portland, Oregon, was more than just a place to live. It was the heart of their family. With its wide porch, expansive garden, and countless rooms, the house was filled with memories of laughter, love, and life. Hello, welcome, enjoy, subscribe, and activate notifications. It was here that they had raised their 4 children, watched them grow, and nurtured their dreams. The house, like their family, had its own personality, vibrant, warm, and welcoming. Eleanor had always taken pride in her home. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every plant in the garden bore her touch. The kitchen was her domain, where she spent hours preparing meals that were as much an expression of her love as they were nourishment. The dining room table, long and sturdy, had witnessed countless family dinners, celebrations, and heart-to-heart conversations. It was where birthdays were celebrated, achievements were lauded, and even the occasional argument took place. But through it all, it was a place of unity, of coming together at the end of the day. John, a retired high school teacher, had his own sanctuaries within the house. His study, lined with bookshelves crammed with literature, history books, and old lesson plans, was where he retreated to read, think, and reflect. He loved the house's quiet corners, where he could sit with a cup of tea, a good book, and lose himself in thought. The garden, too, was a shared passion between him and Eleanor, a place where they spent countless hours planting, pruning, and simply enjoying the beauty they had cultivated together. Their children, Emily, David, Robert, and Sarah, had grown up in this house, filling it with the noise and chaos that only a large family can generate. Each child had their own room, their own space, but the house itself was communal. The living room was often a hub of activity, with board games spread out on the coffee table, or movies playing on the TV while the family piled onto the couches. The walls were adorned with family photos, snapshots of birthdays, holidays, and everyday moments that had become treasured memories. Emily, the eldest, had always been the ambitious one. Even as a child, she had been determined and focused, always striving for excellence. It came as no surprise to anyone when she announced she had been offered a prestigious job in New York. Eleanor and John were proud, but the thought of their eldest daughter leaving the house, leaving Portland, was bittersweet. The day Emily left was marked with tears and hugs, promises of visits, and the unspoken fear that things would never be the same. David, the second-born, was the adventurer. From a young age, he had shown a restless spirit, always eager to explore, to see what lay beyond the horizon. His passion for photography had taken him on countless trips across the country, and it was no surprise when he decided to leave home to travel through Europe, capturing the world through his lens. His departure was more spontaneous, less planned, but the impact was no less profound. The house felt quieter, less vibrant without David's presence, his stories, and his laughter. Robert, the third child, had always been the steady one. Quiet, thoughtful, and dependable, he had been the glue that held the siblings together. When he announced that he was getting married and moving to Seattle to start a new life with his fiancée, it was a joyful occasion, but it also marked another step in the gradual emptying of the house. Eleanor and John were thrilled for Robert, but as they helped him pack, the reality of another child leaving hit them hard. The once busy household was becoming quieter, emptier. Sarah, the youngest, was the baby of the family, spoiled in the way youngest children often are, but also deeply loved by everyone. She was the last to leave, and in many ways, her departure was the most difficult for Eleanor and John. Sarah had received a scholarship to study in Boston, and while they were immensely proud of her, the thought of their youngest leaving the nest was almost too much to bear. Her departure marked the end of an era. The house that had once been full of life was now nearly empty. With each child's departure, the house changed. Rooms that had once been filled with noise and activity now stood silent. The dining room table, once crowded at every meal, now seemed too large for just 2 people. Eleanor and John found themselves wandering through the house, each room a reminder of the children who were no longer there. The laughter, the arguments, the shared meals, All were now memories, echoes of a time that had passed. The first few weeks after Sarah left were the hardest. Eleanor would often find herself standing in the hallway, listening for the sounds of her children, only to be met with silence. John, too, felt the absence acutely. The house, once a place of joy and energy, now felt too big, too empty. Even the garden, which had always been a source of comfort, seemed less vibrant, as if it too was mourning the loss of the family that had once filled the space. Eleanor tried to keep busy. She threw herself into her gardening, spending hours tending to the flowers and vegetables. But it wasn't the same. The joy she once felt in watching her plants grow was now tinged with sadness. She missed the days when the children would run through the garden, their laughter echoing through the air. She missed the way they would come home from school, dirty and hungry, eager to tell her about their day. John, too, found it difficult to adjust. He spent more time in his study, reading old books, reminiscing about his teaching days. He would often find himself lost in thought, thinking about the students he had taught, the lives he had touched. But even these memories, once a source of pride, now brought a sense of melancholy. He missed the noise, the chaos, the sense of purpose that had come with raising a family. As the days turned into weeks, the silence of the house became more oppressive. Eleanor and John found themselves drifting apart, each lost in their own grief. They still loved each other deeply, but the absence of their children had created a void that neither knew how to fill. Their conversations became shorter, more focused on the practicalities of daily life. The laughter, the shared stories, the intimacy that had once defined their relationship seemed to fade away. It was during one of these quiet evenings, as they sat together in the living room, that Eleanor finally spoke what they had both been feeling. "John," she said softly, her voice trembling, "I miss them so much. I miss the noise, the mess, the life they brought into this house." John looked at her, his eyes filled with the same sadness. "I do too, Eleanor," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I do too." They sat in silence, the weight of their shared grief pressing down on them. It was a silence that spoke of their longing for the days when their house was full, when their lives were full. But deep down, they both knew that they had to find a way to move forward. Their children were living their lives, just as they had raised them to do, and now it was their turn to figure out what life looked like without them. But the question remained. How? How do you find joy in a life that suddenly feels so empty? The days after their conversation were filled with an uneasy silence. Eleanor and John knew they needed to address the void left by their children's departure, but neither knew where to begin. The house, once a place of comfort and warmth, now felt cold and uninviting. Every corner, every room, every object seemed to carry the weight of memories, reminders of a time when their home was alive with the presence of their children. Eleanor found herself drawn to the bedrooms of their children, now eerily tidy and untouched. She would stand in the doorway, staring at the neatly made beds, the books on the shelves, the clothes still hanging in the closets. It was as if she were afraid to move anything, fearing that doing so would erase the last traces of the lives that had once filled these rooms. In Emily's room, the shelves were lined with trophies, awards, and certificates, testaments to her academic and professional achievements. Eleanor would run her fingers over the polished wood of the desk, remembering the nights she had stayed up late helping Emily with school projects, the hours spent encouraging her, guiding her through the challenges of growing up. Now, Emily was miles away in New York, living a life that Eleanor could only glimpse through phone calls and the occasional visit. David's room was a stark contrast, filled with the remnants of his adventurous spirit. Maps covered the walls, dotted with pins marking the places he had visited and the ones he still dreamed of exploring. His camera, the one he had saved for years to buy, sat on the dresser, gathering dust. Eleanor remembered how David had always been restless, always looking for the next adventure, the next challenge. She had always known that he would leave one day, but she hadn't anticipated how much she would miss him. Robert's room was the most orderly, reflecting his steady, reliable nature. His books were neatly arranged, his desk clear of clutter, and the bed perfectly made. Robert had always been the dependable one, the child who never caused trouble, who always did what was expected of him. Eleanor had relied on him in ways she hadn't with the others, and his departure had left a bigger hole than she had expected. She missed his quiet presence, his calm demeanor, and the way he had always been there to help, no matter what. Sarah's room, the last to be emptied, was still filled with the energy of youth. Posters of bands and movies covered the walls, and the desk was cluttered with notebooks, pens, and the remnants of unfinished art projects. Sarah had been the baby of the family, the one who had always brought a spark of joy and spontaneity into their lives. Her departure had been the hardest, and Eleanor often found herself in Sarah's room, sitting on the bed, holding one of her old stuffed animals, and trying to hold back tears. John, too, was struggling. He would retreat to his study, seeking solace in the familiar comfort of his books. But even here, the silence was oppressive. He would sit at his desk, pretending to read, but his mind would wander. He would think about his children, about the years they had spent raising them, and wonder if they had done enough, if they had prepared them for the world. He would think about his teaching days, about the students he had mentored, and wonder if they remembered him, if he had made a difference. The phone calls from their children, once a source of joy, now felt like a lifeline. Emily called from New York, her voice full of excitement as she talked about her job, her life in the city, the challenges she was facing. David would call from whatever country he was in, his voice crackling with the excitement of his latest adventure. Robert, ever the practical one, would call on Sundays, his tone steady as he discussed work, asked about the house, and offered advice. Sarah's calls were the most frequent, her voice filled with the energy of youth as she talked about her studies, her new friends, and the excitement of living in Boston. But as much as they cherished these calls, they only served to highlight the distance, the fact that their children were living their own lives, far away from the house that had once been their home. Eleanor and John would hang up the phone, the silence that followed even more deafening than before. The holidays loomed on the horizon, a time that had always been filled with joy and celebration, but now seemed to be a reminder of all that they had lost. Eleanor and John went through the motions, decorating the house, putting up the tree, hanging the stockings, but it wasn't the same. The decorations, instead of bringing warmth and joy, only served to highlight the emptiness of the house, the absence of their children. Eleanor found herself dreading Christmas. It would be the first time in years that they would be spending it alone. The thought of sitting down to a Christmas dinner, just the two of them, was almost unbearable. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter, of excited voices, of the chaos of Christmas morning, would now be silent. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, Eleanor couldn't hold it in any longer. The weight of the silence, the emptiness, the loneliness, it all came crashing down on her. She began to cry, the tears she had been holding back for so long finally spilling over. John, startled by the sound of her sobs, turned to her, his heart breaking as he saw the pain in her eyes. He had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together, but in that moment, he realized how much they both had been struggling, how much they both missed their old life, their family. When her tears finally subsided, Eleanor looked up at John, her eyes red and swollen. "I don't know how to do this, John," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how to be happy without them." John didn't have the answers. He didn't know how they were supposed to move on from this, how they were supposed to find joy in a life that felt so empty. But he knew that they had to try, for each other, if not for themselves. "We'll figure it out together," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "We'll find a way, Eleanor. We have to." And so, in the quiet of their empty home, Eleanor and John made a silent pact to find a way to live again, to find a new purpose, a new reason to be happy. They didn't know what that would look like or how long it would take, but they knew they had to try. Eleanor and John woke the next day with a sense of determination, though it was tinged with uncertainty. The realization that they needed to find a new way to live had settled over them like a heavy blanket, comforting in its clarity, yet daunting in its weight. They had spent their entire adult lives focused on their children, their careers, and each other. But now, with the house empty, they were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had lost touch with who they were as individuals. Eleanor began her day by going through her usual routine, making breakfast, tidying up the kitchen, and checking on the garden. But there was no rush, no pressing need to get things done before the children woke up or returned home. The house was quiet, the tasks felt mundane, and Eleanor found herself moving through them almost mechanically. She decided to take a walk in the garden, hoping to find some solace in the flowers and plants she had nurtured for so many years. The garden had always been her refuge, a place where she could lose herself in the simple joys of planting, pruning, and watching things grow. But today, as she wandered through the paths, she felt an unfamiliar heaviness in her heart. The roses, usually her pride and joy, seemed dull and lifeless. The vegetables she had carefully tended to were ready for harvest, but the thought of picking them and preparing meals for just herself and John felt hollow. She missed the days when the children would run through the garden, chasing each other, their laughter filling the air. She missed the way they would come to her with their little hands full of flowers, proudly presenting them as if they were the most precious gifts in the world. As she walked, Eleanor realized that the garden, once a symbol of life and growth, now felt like a burden. The tasks that had once brought her joy now seemed pointless, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was simply going through the motions, trying to fill the emptiness that had taken root in her heart. John, too, was struggling to find purpose in his day. He spent the morning in his study, surrounded by books and papers that had once been his sanctuary. But even here, the silence was oppressive. He tried to lose himself in a book, but his mind kept wandering back to the past, to the days when the house was full of life. He thought about his teaching days, about the students he had mentored, the lessons he had taught. He had always taken pride in his work, in the impact he had made on young lives. But now, as he sat alone in his study, he couldn't help but wonder if any of it really mattered. The students had moved on just as his children had, and he was left behind, feeling like a relic of a time that had passed. In an effort to distract himself, John decided to tackle some household chores. He fixed a leaky faucet, replaced a light bulb, and tidied up the garage. But each task felt like an attempt to stave off the emptiness that was slowly consuming him. He missed the days when the house was bustling with activity, when there was always something that needed to be done, someone who needed his help. As the day wore on, Eleanor and John found themselves drifting through the house, each lost in their own thoughts. They passed each other in the hallway, exchanged brief words, but the connection that had once been so strong seemed to be fading. The house, once a symbol of their love and their family, now felt like a reminder of all that they had lost. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, the silence between them was palpable. The dining room, once filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter, was now quiet, the only sound the clinking of silverware on plates. Eleanor had prepared a simple meal, roast chicken, potatoes, and a salad, but the food tasted bland, the act of eating more of a necessity than a pleasure. John tried to start a conversation, asking Eleanor about her day, but the words felt forced, hollow. Eleanor responded with a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She was trying, he knew that, but it wasn't enough. The weight of their shared grief was too heavy, and neither of them knew how to lift it. After dinner, they retreated to the living room as they always did. John picked up a book, Eleanor her knitting, but the silence between them was deafening. They had always found comfort in each other's presence, in the simple act of being together, but now, even that felt like a burden. It was Eleanor who finally broke the silence. "John," she said quietly, "do you ever wonder if we made the right choices?" John looked up from his book, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" Eleanor set her knitting aside and met his gaze. "I mean, did we do enough for them? Did we prepare them for the world? Did we give them everything they needed?" John sighed, setting his book down. He had been asking himself the same questions, though he hadn't voiced them until now. "I think we did the best we could," he said slowly. "But it's hard, isn't it? Letting them go, knowing that they're out there living their lives without us." Eleanor nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I miss them so much, John. I miss the noise, the chaos, the mess. I miss being needed. John reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. I miss it too, he admitted. But they're not gone, Eleanor. They're just living their lives, just like we did when we were their age. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, her heart heavy with emotion. But what about us? What do we do now? John didn't have an answer. He didn't know what the future held for them, didn't know how they were supposed to move forward. But he knew one thing for certain: they had to try. They had to find a way to live again, to find joy in a life that felt so empty. We'll figure it out, he said softly. We'll find a way, Eleanor. Together. And so, they sat there in the quiet of their empty home, holding on to each other, clinging to the hope that somehow they would find a way to move forward. The days that followed were filled with a tentative sense of purpose. Eleanor and John knew they needed to find a way to fill the emptiness in their lives, but they weren't sure where to start. They had spent so many years focused on their children, on their careers, on each other, that they had lost touch with their own desires, their own dreams. Eleanor decided to start small. She began by taking longer walks in the garden, trying to reconnect with the joy she had once found in nurturing her plants. She spent hours pruning the roses, weeding the flower beds, and planting new seeds, hoping that the act of caring for something would help fill the void in her heart. But it wasn't easy. The garden, once a place of solace and comfort, now felt like a reminder of all that she had lost. The flowers, the plants, the trees, they were all growing, thriving, but it felt meaningless. She missed the days when the children would come home from school, their hands full of flowers they had picked just for her. She missed the way they would run through the garden, their laughter echoing through the air. Eleanor tried to push through the sadness, to focus on the beauty of the garden, but the emptiness lingered. She found herself spending more time inside, avoiding the garden altogether. It was too painful, too much of a reminder of the life she had once had. John, too, was struggling to find meaning in his days. He had always been a man of routine, of purpose, and the sudden lack of structure in his life was unsettling. He spent hours in his study, surrounded by books and papers, but even here, the silence was oppressive. He tried to lose himself in his hobbies, but nothing seemed to hold his interest for long. He would start a project only to abandon it halfway through. He would pick up a book only to set it down after a few pages. The sense of purposelessness that had settled over him was like a fog, thick and impenetrable. In an effort to break free from the monotony, John suggested they take a trip. We've always talked about traveling more, he said one evening as they sat together in the living room. Maybe now is the time to do it. Eleanor looked at him, surprised by the suggestion. They had talked about traveling, about seeing the world, but with the demands of raising a family, those dreams had always been put on hold. Where would we go? She asked, the idea beginning to take shape in her mind. Anywhere we want, John replied with a smile. We could start small, maybe a road trip down the coast or a visit to one of the national parks. And then, who knows? Maybe one day we'll make it to Europe or Australia, or wherever else we've always wanted to go. The idea of traveling, of exploring new places together, reignited a sense of purpose in both of them. It was something to look forward to, something to plan for, and it gave them a reason to move forward. They spent the next few weeks planning their first trip, a road trip down the California coast. It was a place they had always wanted to visit, and the thought of exploring it together brought a spark of excitement back into their lives. The preparations were filled with anticipation. They pored over maps, travel guides, and websites, deciding where to go and what to see. They booked hotels, planned their route, and made lists of all the places they wanted to visit. Eleanor, who had always been the planner of the family, took charge of the details, while John handled the logistics. When the day finally came to leave, they packed up the car with more enthusiasm than they had felt in years. As they pulled out of the driveway, Eleanor looked back at the house, feeling a mixture of sadness and anticipation. It was the first time they would be leaving the house for an extended period since the children had moved out, and it felt like a significant step in their journey of healing. The road trip was everything they had hoped for and more. The drive down the coast was breathtaking, with stunning views of the ocean, cliffs, and forests. They stopped at small towns along the way, exploring local shops, restaurants, and attractions. They visited beaches, hiked in national parks, and even took a detour to visit some of the famous vineyards in Napa Valley. But it wasn't just the sights and experiences that made the trip special. It was the time they spent together. Without the distractions of daily life, they were able to reconnect in a way they hadn't in years. They talked about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. They laughed together, reminisced about the past, and made new memories that were just theirs. As they traveled, Eleanor and John began to notice something unexpected. The pain of their empty nest was still there, but it was starting to fade, replaced by a sense of contentment and peace. They realized that while they would always miss their children, they could still find joy in each other, in the life they were building together. One evening, as they sat on a beach watching the sunset, Eleanor turned to John with a smile. "I think we're going to be okay," she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. John smiled back, taking her hand in his. "I think so too." The trip was a turning point for them, a reminder that life could still be full of beauty and adventure, even in this new chapter. When they returned home, the house didn't feel as empty as it once had. It was still quiet, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet, one that they were starting to appreciate. Eleanor threw herself back into her gardening with renewed vigor, transforming the garden into a vibrant oasis of color and life. John continued to experiment in the kitchen, finding joy in creating new dishes and sharing them with Eleanor. They started hosting small gatherings with friends, filling the house with laughter and conversation once again. But most importantly, they continued to travel. Each trip brought new experiences, new memories, and a deeper bond between them. They explored new places, met new people, and discovered a sense of freedom and joy they hadn't felt in years. They still missed their children, of course, but they no longer felt defined by their absence. They had found a new purpose, a new way of living that brought them happiness and fulfillment. And in doing so, they realized that the empty nest wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of a new one. As Eleanor and John settled back into their routine after the road trip, they both felt a renewed sense of purpose. The trip had been a turning point, a reminder that life could still be full of joy and adventure, even in this new chapter. But they also knew that they needed to continue exploring new avenues, new interests, to fully reclaim their lives. Eleanor decided to take up a hobby she had always been interested in but had never had the time for: painting. She had always loved art, had always felt a connection to the colors, the textures, the emotions that a painting could evoke. But with the demands of raising a family, she had never pursued it seriously. Now, with the house quiet and the days stretching out before her, Eleanor enrolled in a local art class. It was a small, intimate group, mostly women of her age, all of them looking for a way to express themselves, to fill the emptiness that had crept into their lives. The class quickly became a sanctuary for Eleanor, a place where she could lose herself in the creative process, where she could explore her emotions through color and form. She spent hours in her studio, a small room in the back of the house that had once been a storage space. She transformed it into a haven of creativity, filling it with canvases, paints, and brushes. She painted landscapes, still lives, abstract pieces, whatever came to her in the moment. It was a way for her to process her feelings, to explore the grief and the joy that coexisted in her heart. As she painted, Eleanor found herself reflecting on her life, on the choices she had made, the paths she had taken. She thought about her children, about the joy they had brought her, but also about the sacrifices she had made, the dreams she had put on hold. She realized that, for the first time in years, she was living for herself, pursuing something that was entirely her own. John, inspired by Eleanor's newfound passion, decided to pursue his own interests. He had always been fascinated by history, by the stories of the past, the lessons that could be learned from those who had come before. He decided to volunteer at a local museum, a small but well-respected institution that focused on the history of the region. At the museum, John found a new sense of purpose. He gave tours, helped with exhibits, and spent hours poring over historical documents and artifacts. He loved the feeling of being part of something larger than himself, of contributing to the preservation of history. It was a way for him to stay connected to his past as a teacher while also exploring a new field of interest. These new pursuits brought a sense of fulfillment back into their lives. They were no longer just waiting for the phone to ring, for their children to visit. They were actively engaged in their own lives, finding joy in their own pursuits. And as they did, they found that their relationship grew even stronger. They would often spend their evenings together in the living room, each immersed in their own hobbies. Eleanor painting, John reading or researching for his next museum tour. It was a quiet, comfortable routine, one that brought them both a sense of peace and contentment. But even as they found new joy in their hobbies, they remained deeply connected to each other. They continued to take walks together, to cook meals together, to talk about their days and their dreams. The house, once a symbol of emptiness and loss, had become a place of renewal, a place where they could explore their own interests while also nurturing their relationship. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the garden, John turned to Eleanor with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I think we've found something here, something important." Eleanor looked at him, curious. "What do you mean?" "I mean," John continued, "we've spent so many years focused on the kids, on the family, that I think we forgot about ourselves, about our own dreams. But now we're finally living for ourselves, pursuing our own passions. And it feels good, doesn't it?" Eleanor smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. "It does," she agreed. "It feels like we're reclaiming our lives, like we're finally living the way we always wanted to." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on how far they had come. They had faced the pain of an empty nest, the loneliness, the grief, but they had also found a way to heal, to move forward, and to create a new life that was full of love, joy, and purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor reached over and took John's hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm glad we're doing this together," she said softly. "Me too," John replied, his voice filled with emotion. "Me too." As the weeks turned into months, Eleanor and John continued to explore their new interests, but they also began to rediscover each other in ways they hadn't expected. With the demands of raising a family no longer taking up all their time, they found themselves talking more, sharing stories, and reconnecting on a deeper level. They started taking evening walks together, something they hadn't done in years. Their neighborhood, once just a backdrop to their busy lives, became a place of exploration. They would walk hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing, enjoying the simplicity of being in each other's company. John found himself opening up to Eleanor in ways he hadn't before. He talked about his fears, his regrets, and the things he wished he had done differently. He shared stories from his childhood, memories that he hadn't thought about in years. Eleanor listened, offering her own stories in return, and in doing so, they began to see each other in a new light. They also started trying new things together. They took a cooking class at a local community center, learning how to make dishes they had never tried before. They joined a book club, where they met new people and engaged in lively discussions about literature. They even started attending a local theater group's performances, something they had always meant to do but never had the time for. These activities brought a sense of excitement and adventure back into their lives. They were no longer just parents. They were individuals with their own interests, their own desires. And in exploring these together, they began to build a new life, one that was still full of love and companionship, even without their children at home. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were still days when the emptiness of the house weighed heavily on them, when the memories of their children were too strong to ignore. On those days, Eleanor and John would sit together in the living room, holding hands, and allow themselves to grieve. They knew that moving on didn't mean forgetting, and that it was okay to miss their children, to miss the life they had once had. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, John turned to Eleanor with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he began, "we've spent so many years focusing on the kids, on the family, that I think we forgot about our own dreams, our own plans." Eleanor looked at him, curious. "What do you mean?" "I mean," John continued, There are things we always said we would do, but never got around to. We've always talked about traveling more, seeing the world, but we never did. Maybe now is the time to do that. Eleanor felt a spark of excitement at the idea. They had talked about traveling, about seeing places they had only read about in books or seen on television. But with the demands of raising a family, those dreams had always been put on hold. Where would we go? She asked, the possibilities beginning to unfold in her mind. Anywhere we want, John replied with a smile. We could start small, maybe a road trip down the coast, or visit some of the national parks. And then, who knows? Maybe one day we'll make it to Europe or Australia, or anywhere else we've ever dreamed of going. The idea of traveling, of exploring the world together, reignited a sense of purpose in both of them. It was something to look forward to, something to plan for, and it gave them a reason to move forward. And so, with renewed hope and determination, Eleanor and John began to plan their first trip. It was a small step, but it was a step toward a new life, a life that was still full of love, adventure, and joy. The trips Eleanor and John took together became more than just a way to see the world. They became a way to rediscover themselves, to reclaim the parts of their lives that had been put on hold for so many years. Each journey brought new experiences, new challenges, and a deeper bond between them. They visited the Grand Canyon, marveled at the vastness of the landscape, and felt a sense of awe at the natural beauty of the world. They traveled to Europe, exploring the historic streets of Paris, the canals of Venice, and the rolling hills of Tuscany. They stood in awe of the ancient ruins of Rome, walked along the cobbled streets of Prague, and soaked in the vibrant culture of Barcelona. But it wasn't just the destinations that mattered. It was the time they spent together, the shared experiences that brought them closer than ever before. They laughed together, marveled at the sights, and even faced challenges together, like getting lost in a foreign city or navigating language barriers. These trips were a way for them to reconnect not just with each other, but with the world around them. They met new people, experienced new cultures, and discovered a sense of wonder that had been missing from their lives for so long. But as much as they loved their travels, Eleanor and John also found joy in the simple pleasures of life at home. They continued to pursue their hobbies, with Eleanor painting and John volunteering at the museum. They hosted dinners with friends, filled their home with laughter and conversation, and found a new rhythm to their lives that was both fulfilling and meaningful. One day, as they were sitting together in the garden, Eleanor turned to John with a smile. "I think we've come full circle," she said. "We started with a family, and now we've created a new one." John nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Yes, we have," he agreed. "And I couldn't be happier." They had faced the challenges of an empty nest, the loneliness, the grief, but they had also found a way to heal, to move forward, and to create a new life, a life that was full of love, joy, and purpose. As they looked toward the future, they knew that whatever it held, they would face it together, with the same love and determination that had carried them through all these years. For Eleanor and John, the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning, and they were ready to embrace it together. The years continued to pass, and with each one, Eleanor and John grew closer, their bond deepening as they continued to explore life together. They had reclaimed their lives, rediscovered their love for each other, and found a new sense of purpose that filled their days with joy. Their children, though still living their own lives, remained close. They visited often, bringing their own families, filling the house with the sounds of laughter and love once again. And while Eleanor and John cherished these visits, they no longer defined their happiness by them. They had found a way to be content, to be fulfilled, even when the house was quiet. One day, as they were sitting together on the porch, watching their grandchildren play in the garden, Eleanor turned to John with a smile. "We did it," she said. "We found our way back to happiness." John smiled, taking her hand in his. "Yes, we did," he agreed. "And it was worth every step." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on their journey, on how far they had come. They had faced the challenges of an empty nest, the loneliness, the grief, but they had also found a way to heal, to move forward, and to create a new life, a life that was full of love, joy, and purpose. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that whatever it held, they would face it together, with the same love and determination that had carried them through all these years. For Eleanor and John, the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning, and they were ready to embrace it together.